Hey guys, it's Luca from Learning MTG, and it's like 4 in the morning right now. And I feel kind of inspired to make this video. It's not really planned out, so it's gonna just kind of be like whatever comes to mind in the moment. But I wanted to talk about the sum total of everything I've learned. So really just kind of a synthesis of like everything I've learned over the course of my entire life and kind of I don't know how I deal with life or cope with life, however you want to say it. How I inform my decision making. Um, so yeah, let's get into it. I think the way I'll approach this is kind of like talking about how my life has kind of transpired. So in the beginning, I really started with math. Um, both my parents are professors, um, both with kind of like quantitative backgrounds. My mom, I think she got like a master's in math, so she probably studied more math than I have even. And my dad has a PhD in finance, so there's a lot of math there. And growing up, my mom would she would teach me math like that's how we kind of played, because she's so adept at teaching math. And I remember, like, for example, she would do stuff like, okay, here's the circle, let's cut it into two pieces, now let's cut it into four, let's cut it into smaller and smaller pieces and approximate closer and closer to what the value of pi is. um, or at some point she taught me what like a Pythagorean triple was, and I started to explore that. What are how many Pythagorean triples can I find? This sort of thing. So from a very young age, I played around with math, and I was so lucky to have someone like my mom. It's probably the equivalent of, I don't know, a musician having a parent that's a musician and teaching them all sorts of musical things at a very young age. So really that was like my starting point. And to me, math is kind of synonymous with like logic or rationality. It basically gives you this black and white picture of things, right? So you could say like, okay, is x greater than 4? If it is, okay, then I know it's not true. X can't be less than 4, right? So therefore, I know that this is not true. It it's a system, and you can kind of solve problems. Um, and certain information basically gives you can go down in like a chain of steps. Okay, is x greater than 4? Okay, then I know x can't be 3, I know it can't be 2, I know it can't be 1, and so on and so forth. um, and I guess that's what I mean by like a rationality, and that was how I viewed the world. And I think most people in our society have this view of the world. It's kind of on a subconscious level, this is the way that we grow up in school. um, Really, I think it comes from school, but probably also comes from other places as well. I mean, I'd say you see it in society in different ways. Nowadays there's this whole like thing about science, like, oh, what is the science behind mask wearing? Where it's like, okay, if you are greater than 6 feet away, you're safe, but if you're 5.99 feet away from someone, then you're not safe, right? Um, and I think that by itself, wait, let me, if you're greater than 6 feet away from someone, you're safe, and uh, if X is 5.999 feet, then you're gonna get COVID, right? Like, I think that is probably a good illustration of when you take rationality a bit too far, or when you just see the whole world as everything must be rational. And that really was how I saw the world, probably until I was, I don't know, maybe 25 or so, maybe 24. it probably wasn't until I finished my master's actually. So that was my starting point, right? And I think, um, well, let me talk about where I am now. Now I believe that, that kind of logical, rational, mathematical way is like one side of a coin. There's another side to that coin. It's like you're only seeing half of reality when you think of things rationally. It's like night to day, or it's like odd numbers to even numbers, or it's like female to male, or whatever, right? In a certain way, you can't have females without males, you can't have chickens without eggs, you can't have eggs without chickens. Um, so it's just kind of like that one half of the whole. That's how I see it now. So knowing that, it was kind of like I mastered that half of life, in my opinion, to a decent degree. I don't know everything about math, but I learned a lot about math and thinking about things logically, solving problems rationally. Um, Other things that rationality give you is it gives you ways to like categorize things. So you could say like there's three different types of clouds. There's cumulus clouds, and you know what I mean, or there's seven different animal kingdoms, or I don't know if I'm saying these things right, or there's three different primary colors. There's yellow and there's red and there's blue, and then you mix the primary colors, you can get like orange and purple and green, right? And so it's like, you're making these nice categorizations, and it can be fun. It can be useful, but you can also probably kind of see of like, okay, well, why did you pick yellow, blue, and red to be your primary colors? Couldn't other things be primary colors? And aren't there an infinite variety of colors? Can you never kind of like categorize them all? So I think that was kind of what I mastered during the first 24 years of my life, something like that. And then I had a big change, and I started to kind of see really the limitations, of logic. The way that I always describe it to people is I basically used logic to examine itself. Right? And that's kind of like what we do, you know, if we're solving an algebraic problem, we're going to go step by step. Maybe you have 2x plus 3 equals 7. Okay, then we'll subtract 3 from both sides. So now we have 2x is equal to 4. And we'll divide both sides by 2. So we know that x is equal to 2, right? But each of these steps has to be done precisely, right? We can't subtract 3 from one side and subtract 4 from the other side. We can't divide this side by 2 and divide this side by 4, right? We have rules to it. And so I basically used the rules of logic and I examined logic. And I found that, logic didn't stand up to its own rules. So is that a problem? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But that's kind of what I found. I think I would even have trouble talking about it right now. Like, how did I use logic on itself? I think, and that's one of the problems, is there are some things you can't talk about. Right? Or another way of saying that is there are some things you can't express mathematically. There are some things you can't define rigorously. There are some things you can't define logically. Some things you can't define rationally. I just recently saw I saw it was like a podcast between Russell Brand and something Ben Shapiro. Um, and I think they both have the same kind of like libertarian views about things, but Ben Shapiro is probably more like conservative, and Russell Brand is more like liberal. And a lot of times Ben would be like, okay, well, can you just define these things for me? Can we make rules, right? And to me, he was coming from like the rational half, and Russell was coming from the other half, the more like spiritual half, or like outside the realm of mathematics. And I think he asked very good questions that Russell cannot answer, and I tend to also agree more with Ben on these sorts of things. I am more conservative, but at the same time, I have to admit that, look, man, there's certain things you can't define things, right? You can't, and society has to. Society has to make laws and rules, but at the same time, you can't perfectly make a law that doesn't have any interpretation to it, and so on and so forth. Um, so it's a difficult thing to talk about. So let me just get back to how I kind of use logic on itself. I think one of the I there are a lot of things that happened to me at the same time during this period of time. I started listening to Sadhguru a lot. I went and did his inner engineering program. I was also reading certain books. I read a book, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. That was a really, really big turning point for me. I'll explain that in a second. Let me just write it down so I remember. So Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. Oops. Well, we'll just flip the E and the T. Who cares? Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. And also I had what did I have? I did. Why is my mind blanking on this right now? Hypnosis. I had hypnosis or hypnotherapy done on me, and that kind of also exposed me to this other more like spiritual side of things. And so kind of there were a lot of different things going on in my life at the same time, but I basically started to see this other side of life, right? Where is like the first 24 years were the logical, mathematical side of life. I started to see this other side of life, which I would call spiritual. People don't like spiritual though. So, I mean, there's lots of things you call it, intuition. You know, you can't get away from this. There's some people that are kind of like, well, I'm atheist and I only believe in science. It's like, okay, well, where do your dreams come from? Where do your intuitions come from? Why is the whole universe so magical and everything works perfectly, and where does your love come from? And then actually that takes us nicely to this is like in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, they talk about the scientific method, right? And if you're a super hardcore science person, you think science is the end all, the be all end all. Well, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance is like, okay, scientific method. Step one is your hypothesis, right? Create a hypothesis. Where do those hypotheses come from? How do you create a hypothesis? And that will hit hard if you make this thought experiment, because the only way a hypothesis can come from your intuition, come from your imagination, come from seemingly nowhere, right? And that just shows you that science is not built off of, okay, it's not like, okay, we figured this out and then we figured that out from here, and then it's not like we're building off of a foundation and learning more and more. Really, science is coming off of inspiration. Someone has some inspiration, right? An apple falls on Newton's head, and then things come from that. And then someone else has another inspiration, and then another inspiration. Really, science as it exists today comes from the intuition, right? And if people had different intuitions and different inspirations, we'd have different science. Which is I think hard for people to grasp, because I think most people feel like there's this kind of like bedrock truth about the universe, and we're discovering that truth about the universe, not that we're creating the truth. or at least creating like our version of the truth. Or I mean, one of the interesting things that you can learn about is there are different types of geometry, right? So in Western civilization, we use like a lot of Euclidean geometry. So Euclidean geometry is like right angles. This is how we build our buildings. Um, you've got basically these parallel lines in this direction and parallel lines in this direction, right? And a lot of our structures look like this. But in other cultures, you have more radial things. I think like the Native Americans used a lot more circles. They didn't do this sort of thing. And there are probably infinitely other types of geometries, right? So just the culture you in can make you think in terms of squares and rectangles versus in terms of circles, right? So, you know, a science that comes from this culture will come up with totally different systems in mathematics than a science that comes from this culture, right? So that's kind of how I came to this thing. So I guess, I always go back to this quote from Siddhartha that says the opposite of every truth is just as true, right? Which on its face looks like nonsense, right? But when you really start to think about this and you really start to pay attention, I found that this always holds, right? Which is basically, it's like truth is always shifting, right? So let's say I say, John is a bad man, right? And what if that's true? What if John like murdered someone for no reason? Okay, well, what about a different version of John, Like what about when he was younger? Maybe when John was 4 or whatever, John was a good man. And that would be true, which is basically it's showing you the context matters, right? Or maybe there's a different guy whose name is John, right? So now we can make this go from a bad man to a good man by referring, this is John 1 and this is John 2. Or maybe we're changing our definitions of what bad is, or maybe we're changing our definitions of what a man is, right? And so there's infinite context to any kind of statement. Any kind of logical statement has infinite context. And so as you change the context, you can make it so that the opposite is true. Let me try to think of like a mathematical example. Things like this doesn't work so well in math because in math it's like it's not, reality is not math. If reality was math, it'd be very different, It would be like, math is like a highly oversimplified realm. Like we make things very, very simple. I know for a lot of people math feels like it's so complicated, but, if you think about the difference between, let's say, real analysis, okay, we're using these numbers, and okay, what is a real number? Okay, it's basically a decimal, so it's like 3.431776, right? So it's any number that's like, or 43 point that. So it's any number that has all these things, right? So there's infinitely many of these numbers, and each of these numbers could be infinitely long. But, that's so much different than like, what I always think about is like playing a soccer game, right? It's like the ball could be on a, on a part of the field that's slightly more elevated because there's slightly more blades of grass and there's 22 players on the field. Everyone's got different emotions going on, different physical strength and speed, different ideas of how to play the game, and you can never calculate any of that, right? You know, I mean, if the world was so black and white, you would just be able to punch things into a calculator and know how to play the soccer game. Okay, always kick the ball with your right foot in this way or whatever. The fact that things are so freaking complicated and so rich and complex means that we can't talk about it in this way. We can't talk about it at all, really. We can only approximate, and then we could talk about it if we approximate or simplify what reality is. So maybe I've kind of lost track, but I think I just want to get back to this, right? So this is kind of like one of these really big foundational things that I learned and that I use in all my decision making, right? This is like one of these bedrock things I hold on to. The opposite of every truth is just as true. And you can apply this to itself. And if you apply the opposite of every truth is just as true to itself, you will find that sometimes the opposite of every truth is not as true. Sometimes the opposite of every truth is false. Right? So what does this do? It basically teaches you to never lean on anything fixed. There's a line in the Tao Te Ching, it's actually the very first line of the Tao Te Ching, and it says, the way that can be told is not the eternal way. The way that can be traveled is not the eternal way. Meaning, the way, or kind of like the most beautiful and least resistant path to walk through life, is not something that can be told to someone. You can't tell someone, okay, do A, B, C, D, and that's the way to live life, or that's the way to, I don't know, make money, or be happy, or X, Y, Z. So you basically you can't lean on a set of rules, right? That's like my rule. My rule is you can't have rules. They can approximate things. Yeah, maybe you want to brush your teeth every day, or maybe you want to not starve to death or whatever, and that's fine. But there is a time to starve to death. There is a time to not brush your teeth. Basically, every rule has exceptions, and I think your life can get very frustrating if you think that there is something that you need to figure out. And once you find that thing, once you've got it figured out, you're all good. Like, I think if you believe that that's, how you're going to do things, you're going to be very disappointed. Because everything is so changing. Everything is in flux. Everything is moving. You can't find that one thing and rest. It's always changing. So that's kind of one of the things I learned from this idea of the opposite of truth, of every truth is just as true. And maybe that's the only thing that I've learned, now that I think about it. I think, no, there's probably like one more big idea. Yeah, there are a few more ideas, but okay, so this is a nice one though, right? So, there's these two aspects of life. So there's the rational aspect of life, and then there's the irrational. Okay, this is like the math, and this is like the spirit. So that's maybe step one, is realizing that there's these two things. You can't try to solve everything rationally. You can't try to rely on a rational method. You can't lean on some kind of dictum. You can't lean on a set of rules, because everything's always changing. So then I started to explore, okay, what is this other side of things, right? For example, I read a great book. Oh man, it was like, I forget what the name of the book is, but it's about Jesse Livermore, or maybe the author is Jesse Livermore. And he's basically, a lot of people say he's the best investor of all time. He like shorted the market and made millions of dollars back when money was worth way more. So maybe in today's standards, he made billions of dollars or whatever. But in that book, this is arguably the greatest investor of all time. He really talked about how a lot of his investments were made from the heart, from the gut, from instinct, from he would have no logical explanation for why he needed to do, but he just felt in his gut that he had to buy this or sell this, right? So I started to explore this aspect, the spiritual aspect, this aspect of life that you can't talk about. Um, I think it's maybe synonymous with intuition, highly connected with this idea of intuition. Um, and so I read lots of different spiritual teachings, lots of different books that talks about this, and I think it led me down a certain path, and I think these ideas will be very, very controversial, but I don't really care. You know, I was actually thinking about this earlier today. Um, there's this climber, Alex Honnold, right? And he climbs up these huge things with no rope. uh, and so, if he slips, he's dead or whatever. And I think, you know, at first when he started doing that, he was afraid, but he just did it so much that he eroded away that fear. He numbed away that fear. And on a similar level, I think that in my life, I've gone against the grain of society so many times, in so many different ways. It just feels like over the course of my life, I've kind of eroded this sense of I need to agree with people, or I need people to like me, or I need I need to not look like a fool, or not look like a retard, or not look like some crazy guy who's got these weird ideas and has lost his mind. So I think that's good. I don't have any problem with talking about these things if it turns off 90% of the people who watch this. So um, I think when you dive into this spirituality, you realize that we're not just physical. Okay? So there's this other aspect of life that's not physical. It's not connected to the physical world. Okay? Let's just call it spirit. And basically, you'll start to kind of learn about the nature of life. Why are we here? What happens when we die? What happens before we were born? Um, One of the big things that I learned is that consciousness creates matter, right? Or like the physical form, not vice versa. It's not that, we evolved from amoebas and then we developed consciousness. I don't think that makes any sense. But it's kind of like our cultural mythology. But yeah, that's kind of, I think, what we're brought up to learn. But it's the other way around. It's like your mind creates the whole world, which is it's hard to take in and understand at first, I think. But once you learn about these things, and your lifetime is not your only lifetime, right? So when you die, your consciousness doesn't just vanish, and your consciousness was going basically before you were born. And we live multiple lives, multiple human lives. So the whole idea of reincarnation, which I find interesting, how there's entire cultures that believe in it and entire cultures which don't. And just based on which culture you're born into, you're on that side of the argument. But So that's a big thing. And, why do I even bring that up? I think because it tells you that you can, you get guidance from your inner world. So your intuitions are speaking to you basically from another dimension, giving you information on how to live your life. Um, I always find it fascinating how, like, scientists and psychologists and any kind of Western anything has no explanation for your dreams. I think maybe, like, younger, um, who is the other guy? Freud, they'd say, like, oh, your dreams are about unconscious sexual desires or something. I mean, to me, that's kind of nonsense. Um, but, like, where do your dreams come from? If you ever, like, paid attention to your dreams, I was just dreaming today. Um, I remember most of my dreams and I write them down in a journal, and it's like, where the hell does this stuff come from, right? It's totally out there. It's totally creative. It's almost like, where does an artist come up with great piece of art? It's coming from somewhere else. It's not a reconstruction, a regurgitation of something that they've already seen. It's something completely brand new. It's kind of like the hypothesis of the scientific method. Where do the hypotheses come from? They're inspiration. They're coming from this inner world. They're coming from the world of spirit, or the spiritual realm. So I think that that's kind of maybe that's kind of all I need to talk about. Maybe that's everything I've learned over the course of my life. So it's like, there's the two halves. There's the logic versus spirit. And then consciousness creates physical world. And then your inner, let's say, intuitions offer great guidance. I kind of butchered this. Yeah, so I think that's a good way of saying things, right? And if you take what I talked about, which, certain things can't be talked about, the opposite of every true is just as true, that means, okay, these 3 steps are not encapsulating the whole thing. You could write this in 5 steps, in 7 steps. You could write the complete opposite of these 3 steps, and it would all be good, right? So that's kind of the sum total of everything I've learned over the course of my life. Kind of a weird video, but I think maybe 1 or 2 people will find this enjoyable, and maybe even more. I hope so. I hope this helps someone. And I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.